beginning with Caroline Russell in the next set of questions.
So I just want to pick up on one thing that's just been covered in the previous bit, but just to clarify that about the confirmation that people get of their settled or pre-settled status, which is, I think, did I understand that's in digital format only? So presumably that could pose problems for people, and I think you have touched on it slightly, but I just want to see if there's anything else anyone wants to say on this. In terms of accessing housing, renting, bank accounts and any other public services, is there anything you haven't said so far that you'd like to add on that?
So I think I can talk about that. So the way that employers, for example, will be able to access that is by going on telling their employee or the person they want to employ to give them access to the digital status, and they will get a code sent to them, and the employer will then be able to plug that in and be able to see this screen, which has basically got a photo of the person on with all their details. So that will be the same then for people if you want to rent, etc. The problems that are going to arise are that you have to update, the applicant has to update their details. Everything is linked to their passport and their passport number. So if they get a new passport, they need to update the Home Office. If they change their telephone number, they need to update the Home Office because they are sent codes through on their telephone, like the banks do sometimes now. So forgetting to do this, which is going to happen, I don't know how often, is going to lead to real problems in the future. It's going to lead to employers having to stop employment for people because they can't check their status and things like this. So the knock-on effect of this is quite dire. And at the moment, the Home Office hasn't set up a system for people to be able to change their passports other than sending your passport in. Now, exactly. So tell an EU citizen that they've got to send their passport in, they look at you in horror and they're like, well, what do you mean? Now, I'm sure at some point they will change this, I presume, and they will get it in the same way that they can read the chip at the moment on the phone, and that information will be sent to them. But at the moment, they haven't got any plans, as far as I know, to do that. I'm sure they will at some point, but at the moment it's slightly dire.
So anyone with a slightly normal life, which means kind of changing a phone number or losing a passport and getting a replacement passport, that's automatically introducing barriers to safety around your immigration status.
Yes.
I think it's very disturbing that it applies to public sector services as well as private. So DWP application, council applications for housing benefits, NHS in future, that will cover EU nationals checks as well. There is also this functionality, I'm being told, that has been opened for those other organizations. But again, I mean, the question is not only whether my 78-year-old user is going to tackle the system to basically apply for, I don't know, pension credit. The question is if a small employer or a landlord who might happen to be 78-year-old person is going to be able to tackle the system to check if I'm the person that can be employed or that can be rented, the flat or the house. Because sometimes my feeling is that conversations with government about these duties put on private people, so businesses like the landlords or employers, is that we are looking at multinationals having like a brigade of HR people dealing with this stuff. Actually, probably I'm quite keen to hear whether the next panel will mention that the number of small businesses that are being run by, for and with EU nationals in London alone is humongous. Mm-hmm. So if my duty will be to check everyone, my simple calculation will be, therefore I would rather employ someone where I understand what the stamp in the passport says. We are not having stamp in the passport, obviously. It is an issue that I see in terms of unintended discrimination that might become a problem for London, I think, not only from human point of view, but also from business point of view, where we are all in this together.
And do we know, for British citizens living in EU countries, are other EU countries coming up with similar systems to what the UK is coming up with for EU citizens, for British EU citizens living in other countries?
I will touch on that point, but I think just, if I may, close on your documents issue.
Yes.
There is a simple fix. Just give EU citizens and their family members physical documents. A government, I know, are very keen to trial this new digital-only approach, and they make very repetitive arguments as to why a digital-only status is a good thing. But it strikes me that to trial, because this has never been done before, I think that's really important to stress, this has never been done before, giving people digital-only immigration status, to trial that on several million people, and placing that in a bed of the hostile environment, which is what Barbara was talking about, is madness, frankly, and is going to create some serious problems going further down the line. And there are other things that need to be done that will make this, obviously there will be problems still with physical documents, but it strikes me that it's the lesser of two evils in the grand scheme of this framework. So I just wanted to kind of make that point quite clear. In terms of what our friends, those fellow citizens living in Europe are facing, well, yes, member states are establishing similar systems. Indeed, they have to. The terms of the withdrawal agreement are quite clear. They can choose between what is called a declaratory system or a constitutive system. What the UK has set up here, and indeed that's what it pushed for and negotiated very heavily for during the European elections, was a constitutive system. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if you do not apply for the status, you don't get it, and then the consequences that we've talked about unfold. Whereas the opposite of that is the declaratory status, where a person's legal status is simply declared in law. So people who meet certain criteria are automatically acquiring their legal status. So the issue only therefore is providing proof, rather than just becoming unlawfully resident in the UK and being denied access to services and so forth. Those two systems are on offer under the terms of the withdrawal agreement. The UK government has chosen to go down the constitutive road, and there is evidence to suggest that other member states have decided, because the UK has pushed for this and because the UK is doing that, it will do that to British citizens living in member states.
Yeah.
And it is ratcheting up because of the no deal threats that were going on, and we have seen that systems have been popping up here and there, but they haven't exactly been very as clear or as laid out as they have been here in the UK. But it is fair to say there has been an element of reciprocity, shall we say, in the UK's pursuit of the settled status scheme.
Just utterly worrying. I mean, imagining so many UK citizens who are living, have made their lives across Europe, assuming they had the rights of free movement, and yes, if the actions of our government are actually impacting on not only the people coming to live in this country, but also people from this country living abroad, that is massively increases the numbers of people who are.
It is the nature of international trade, reciprocity. What you do to one person, they will do to another. It is. Yeah. It is a very basic principle in a negotiation, and I do believe, and based on the reports that I get from colleagues who live in Europe who are British citizens, that is playing a part, has played a part in the negotiations so far, and it's likely to play a part in the future negotiations.
Yes.
I was just going to add, I think, one of the things that has been forgotten when this system was set up is how readily people have been able to move. People come here, they do a bit of work here, they go back, and we have this circular movement of a lot of people doing short-term contracts and work here. And this system has not been set up for those people at all. So all the frontier workers stuff, what I call frontier workers, where people are living in one place but coming in and working for short periods of time often, or I do some work for the Association of British Orchestras. They're very worried at the Opera House, for example, about how they're going to fly in the German who's going to sing for the night because the person that they had on, who was supposed to be singing has got a sore throat. They're not going to be able to do that. And this system doesn't at the moment account for that at all. Obviously we'll get the immigration bill and we'll see what happens in the future, but that flexibility, that ability to come in, work for a short time, do something quickly, return is going to be lacking in the way that it is now. And I think we underestimate, especially probably in London, how many people are doing that, how many people are coming in and out, working short periods of time. University lecturers who are living abroad but coming in and working at our universities full time, but they're very flexible, and those sort of things are going to become a lot more difficult. And if we were just to go back to the pre-settled status, sorry to go backwards, but one of the things about pre-settled status is you need to build up 5 years to get settled status. If you break your continuity, you won't get settled status. So if you stay out for more than 6 months in a year, you won't get settled status. And at that point, you're stuck. You've got nothing that you can actually apply for, because at the moment there are no categories in the immigration law which you'll be able to go into. So a lot of people who are living their lives by going in and out and being very flexible at the moment, who will have got pre-settled status, might hit a brick wall in 5 years' time because they can't actually move on to another status. They will have to then move into a status that we might get from the immigration bill, but we don't know anything about at the moment. So there are definitely knock-on effects from this system that haven't been completely thought through and are going to have effects on our economy.
Is there anything that you think the Mayor could or should be doing to ensure that those frontier workers, as you called them, can continue to work in London after January 2021?
So I think anybody who can apply for status should and gets pre-settled status. So people who are living in two places are able to apply and often will qualify, not always, but will be able to qualify. Apart from that, pushing the government knows if they've got a withdrawal agreement, they will have to do something about frontier workers. They know that. But I think this is something that people should be lobbying with. Companies who are using this type of labour should be lobbying the government now, making them aware that this flexibility is something that we don't want to lose. It's really, really important, because it can be adopted into a new immigration system if we want, but it's much more difficult. And you can't, you don't have that sort of flexibility with Australia just because of the distance away, but you do need that with your closest partners who you're trading with, or that you want for cultural things to come in and that type of thing. So I think any pressure that can be put on the government to start thinking about this and start thinking about flexibility of workforce is important.
Yeah. Can I just go back to the protection of rights, both for EU nationals in this country and across the EU, things like pension rights. What does all of this settled status and the potential of people falling between the stools and not achieving settled status, what impact does that have on people's pension rights, both for people here in the UK and for people across Europe?
Yeah. So I think what's important to make clear is that settled status, and whatever status it is that you get through the scheme, is a immigration status. It gives you the right to reside in the UK, essentially, the right of residence. Pension entitlements and things like that are related but distinct in a sense. Under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, the UK is the coordination element between member states will exist for those that fall within scope of the withdrawal agreements, those EU citizens resident in the UK before December 2020, and likewise UK citizens living on the continent. So under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, the architecture essentially remains, and that coordination function will stay in place. How that works and what that looks like, I haven't yet managed to scrutinise the withdrawal agreement bill, which essentially sets out how this will be dealt with. But if it's anything like the implementation of a citizens' rights element of withdrawal agreement bill, much of it is delegated away to the minister to be able to deal with on their own. So in terms of insight into the mechanics, I'm afraid there's not much to say at this moment in time. But under the terms of withdrawal agreement, that coordination element would still exist. If there's no deal, and let's be clear, no deal is still a possibility. The 31st of January is just an extension of the leave date. Obviously, politically, there does seem to be more appetite for the withdrawal agreement now than there ever has been. But ultimately, there is the prospect of no deal. Then that coordination function isn't there, and the UK government would have to then pursue that with the member states.
Individually, 27
That's
relationships.
my understanding, that they would have to go to each individual member state.
Which sounds
No.
kind of
exactly.
unimaginably complicated and undesirable.
We've not even touched on, healthcare coordination from the point of view of those British citizens living in Europe and how that's going to work. We're not here. We're not here to speak to the consequences of Brexit on them as much as I'd like to. But that's the whole point comes down to reciprocity. What is done here will be done to others abroad.
I think there is also certain some sort of effect on pension. Pensions is something that people do think about, obviously, especially if they're actually quite young. And there seems to be quite a significant group of European nationals who might be considering leaving the UK for any European country within EU in case of no deal Brexit, simply because they don't want to be left without pensions. Maybe it might be, or with worse conditions on drawing pensions in this certain. So that is a consideration in terms of workforce, for example, and kind of loss of talent, especially for London place. It would be something to think about. So I would imagine that needs to be, information has to be as provided as quickly to people as possible, so that they can make informed choice and not just bet on leaving the country because maybe they really don't have to.
Because if you go abroad, if you've accumulated your pension in the UK up to now and you go and live abroad outside the EU, your pension doesn't uprate, so it basically freezes. Now the government has announced that they will uprate if there's a no deal for up to 3 years. Well, for 3 years, sorry, and beyond that then unclear, and then they would want to have some negotiations. So for people who've lived here but want to retire and worked here and then want to retire abroad, that's not very attractive. So that, people who are thinking in those terms, that will be something that puts them off if we go through no deal. Now, obviously, hopefully that won't be the case, and there will be negotiation and agreement on how to deal with these things. But as Luke indicated, these things, negotiating these things is a nightmare. Yeah.
And particularly so if the reciprocity is
down,
set up by a kind of lack of good faith at this end.
Trust, yeah.
Just finally, sort of picking up on some of the sense of betrayal. I think one of you talked about the sense of betrayal that people felt, particularly around their rights. And I was contacted by an EU citizen constituent who was very worried about something that they saw in The Guardian on the 22nd of October, which was Jeremy Morgan QC saying that EU citizens merely had permissions under settled status rather than legal rights, because the scheme was a statement of executive policy of the government rather than law. This person was worried that these decisions, that executive power could be exercised at any moment, this way or that, without any public debate, let alone the need for democratic consent by the representatives of the British people. So, i.e. that this was giving a lot of power to the executive, to the government, without parliamentary with the potential for no parliamentary scrutiny for future decisions that might affect rights, like voting rights. And I just wonder if you have anything to comment on that.
Yeah.
Do you want to say about legislation?
Well, I think a starting point is that, again, Alison and Barbara, but we will speak to our experience as immigration lawyers. We are very used to living in a world where immigration policy is dictated by secondary legislation, negative secondary legislation, I might add, which is essentially, the immigration rules are a very unique creature in that sense, that essentially the executive, the government, can just change the rules at the flick of a pen if they wanted to. And that happens regularly and is the bane of my life, as is the bane of Alison's life, and every other immigration lawyer that practices in UK immigration law. That principle will essentially extend to EU citizens under the terms of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. It is essentially, what it does is it will allow the executive to make the decisions and amend and change things in accordance to how they wish to do it, and that's the structure of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. It uses Henry VIII powers to do that. I think what is important, though, is that rights of EU citizens would be in large protected under the terms of the withdrawal agreement if that is adopted, because the principle of direct effect would apply, and therefore EU citizens can rely on their rights directly to the withdrawal agreement if it is ratified and so forth. But the day-to-day implementation, the on-the-ground, enacting of the various structures, the rules and so forth, that will be solely the purview of the Crown, using secondary legislation. And obviously there are elements of scrutiny, but I think the last time that a piece of secondary legislation was defeated was 1973 or something, it's ancient history. So, in the grand scheme of things. So I think the concerns that people have about elements of their rights being sort of eroded and scratched away at by the use of these sort of executive powers is a legitimate concern, and is one that I hope those in Parliament, when the Withdrawal Agreement Bill eventually resurfaces in whatever government or whatever structure that we have, that these sorts of things will be scrutinised in the most appropriate and robust way.
Yep. So, sitting here now, to say to anyone who is an EU citizen living in London, you can't say solidly that their right, say, to vote in the elections they currently have rights to vote in will be protected going forwards, because we have the possibility of no deal. And
well, I think on voting rights, that's a very particular case because they aren't protected by the withdrawal agreement. So during the course of the negotiations, that was made clear that was a domestic competence issue. That was something for the UK to negotiate in the future. So voting rights do not feature in the structure of the withdrawal agreement. So it will be for the government to decide whether or not EU citizens will continue to have them, and I suspect that it will either require primary legislation or the use of Henry VIII powers. The legality of that may be questionable, I don't know, to be able to do that. But there have been discussions, and indeed by the former DEXU Minister Robin Walker did mention that this was something that they would like to have for EU citizens to have after exit, but it would require reciprocity with those other member states, so for UK citizens to have the right to vote there. So in that particular case, I obviously can't guarantee that voting rights will stay. It is the decision of, if it's in the scope of the government to decide, then so be it, but then it'd be Parliament to decide if it's not within the scope of that. But there are various other things that could be changed. I think, for example, say withdrawal agreement does go through, for example, those that are protected by it are those who are working and exercising their treaty rights. The government has been more generous and included a lot more people who are eligible to apply to stay in this country, and they could, if they wanted to, change that. And there is a risk to that.